Good evening. I tend to do my videos like I'm chatting to someone in the back room of a pub in those mythical nationalist meetings that the sort of old school meetings that Mark Collett isn't so keen on, and that's sort of how I tend to do my videos, like I'm talking to a fellow participant in one of those meetings. And just to introduce myself, I'm Gus. I live in Lanzarote. I'm 42 years old. I'm not a professional YouTuber or communicator, but I have been involved in politics and the political movement of nationalism and the alt-right for a long time. So when something happens that I feel quite strongly about, I tend to like to occasionally have my say, even though I'm not a professional YouTuber. Just because I feel so strongly about the issues, and I like to give my contribution and my ideas to the wider debate, and I hope people will find this helpful, and it will help them develop and formulate their own ideas and notions upon what has happened, whether they agree or disagree with everything that I say. And the topic that I feel so strongly about is the protests on the 6th of January at the US Capitol building and the murder, and I don't use that word lightly, of poor Ashli Babbitt. Now, to start at the beginning, the protests were called by Donald Trump, and I watched his speech, and he did a fairly convincing speech about the possibility of fraud in the US election. Now, I think there was some electoral fraud, and I think there was a great deal of votes being harvested through people who don't usually vote, people who are perhaps older or disabled, who were sort of persuaded and had people come around their house to get a postal vote and things like what's called votes harvesting, because there was sort of large areas where there's normally a very low turnout, where there was a very high turnout this time. But even with all that, the numbers are so huge in US elections, I don't know that I'm convinced that it would have been enough to affect the result. It may have been, the possibilities there. I don't trust the left as far as I could throw them, but I wouldn't say I was 100% sure on Trump's claims. But watching his speech on the day, I thought it was a very impressive speech, and he made a very impressive case for it. Now, what that protest and the subsequent march to the Capitol building showed us was two things. And the first is that people are no longer scared to come out on the street openly and show their face out there. I mean, I don't know if you saw my last video about the Vox Party, but people they don't seem as scared as they once were to show their faces on the street and say, I'm a nationalist. I don't like multiculturalism. I don't like the LGBT agenda. I don't like feminism. I don't like liberalism. I don't like all these changes to my ancestral homeland. And more and more people are prepared to come out, show their face on the street, and not be scared of the slurs that the left throw at them. Now, even when I was in the BNP from 2004, then I was in it for a couple of years, then I left, then I rejoined. We didn't really do a lot of big street marches. There was days of action with about 20 or 30 people who would then subdivide into smaller groups, and there was leafleting, obviously in small groups locally, and there were occasional demonstrations when a new mosque or something was about to be built. But again, you're not speaking about more than 20 or 30 max, and the most I ever saw a BMP event was, I think, in 2003 when I went to their red, white and blue. That's the most BMP supporters I ever saw in one place. And I don't think I went again because it was up north. So, and I was based in Biggin Hill in the southeast of England. So I never saw the huge sort of numbers. Thinking in terms of large numbers, the most I saw, I think, was in the back room of the Prince of Wales. It was either just after or just before Nick Griffin was elected to the European Parliament, and the room was standing room only. There must have been 150, maybe 100 in that room. But again, this was away in a meeting. This wasn't out on the street. So this sort of large-scale street action is a new development, and it's something we haven't really seen since the late 70s with Martin Webster and John Tyndall and the National Front. So the first thing is this large-scale street movement is an encouraging sign, and it shows people will no longer be intimidated by the left and by these words that they throw, racist, homophobe, that are meant to end all debate and shame people into silence. And we've all fallen for them. We've got to be honest. I remember in my A-level politics class, me and my friend Adrian, I was a mainstream conservative. Well, I was a conservative then, a right-wing conservative, and we had this left-wing lecturer. It was Tony Sowerby, and he did say the word to it. He shouted the word racist at us, and it was enough, because we were only young. This was 1997, about 18, that it was enough to get us to shut up. And what this large-scale street movement shows is that tactic is running out of steam. That you can shout this word racist at people, or homophobe or Islamophobe, and people are going to run away and hide their face, or they're going to be reluctant to go out on the street. That large-scale street movement shows that this tactic is losing its potency, and the left's grip on shame, as it were, and the ability to shame people into silence, into staying in their houses, into being secret about these views. This grip is loosening. And the second thing that protest shows us is what the very clever man Jared Taylor pointed out. It shows us that race matters, because if you look at those protesters, there weren't, the based Trump supporter who they always put up on stage at the rally, the black Trump supporter or the Mexican Trump supporter, they always put up behind him at the rally for him to pretend, oh, not all my supporters are white. You look at that protest, and that was the hardcore of Trump support, and 99.9% of them were white. So this shows race really matters in politics, and someone's race and racial feeling will have a real impact on where they find themselves on the political spectrum. And it really shows the pretense and the hollowness of civic nationalism, because there weren't any black people trying to bash their way or fight their way into the Capitol building for Trump. Now, the next thing we've got to consider is what went wrong with that protest and the subsequent march on the Capitol building, because it did go wrong, because 5 people were tragically and wrongly killed, which is obviously terrible and disgusting. Now, I would say the first thing that went wrong was that there was no leadership. Now, Trump explicitly said in that speech, go up to the Capitol building, I will come with you, I will accompany you, I will lead you. Then what did he do? He went and he hid in his little convoy behind his armed guards and his armour-plated windows, and he went a little way, then he snaked off and hid off. And there comes a point in a leader's time in charge, when they have to sort of put themselves on the line and lead from the front. And there does come that point when that leader has to put themselves personally in the firing line, to put themselves personally at risk. And this can happen in moments of great defeat and great crisis. Now, obviously in December 1941, Stalin, he didn't leave Moscow. And there was a danger in staying in Moscow. But he stayed because if he knew that if he left Moscow, it would have a big effect on the morale of the men fighting on the front. And the same can also be said of Hitler in his last defeat, that he stayed in the bunker, he stayed in Berlin. So there does come a point when part of leadership is you have to step up and you have to risk yourself politically and sometimes even personally. So Trump, he should have got out of those armoured cars, he should have led those people, he should have took control, and had he done so, the crowd would have had direction and command, and the terrible violence and confrontation could have hopefully been avoided. Now, the looking at what happened, I think from what I've seen, most of the violence occurred on the gaining entrance to the building. So the protesters turned up. They felt standing outside with a placard wasn't sufficient to make their point. Trump, their supposed leader, had been a narcissist and a coward, sadly, and it pains me to say this because I supported him in 2016. He had deserted them. He wasn't there either to calm them or lead them in peacefully. So conflict and fights broke out, and sadly, in that melee, there was a policeman who was sadly killed. I think someone threw a fire extinguisher, and obviously the people who did that obviously are guilty of manslaughter and maybe even murder, and so that obviously needs to be looked into, and that is reprehensible. Now, I know there were 3 other people apart from Ashli Babbitt who died, and I think a couple of them had underlying health conditions, and the conflict and the violence set those off, so they suffered, a return of underlying conditions, and were sadly died at the Capitol building. Now, looking at Ashli's death, Ashli Babbitt, this is something I feel the most strongly about, because I did work as a policeman in Westminster from 2015 to 2020, and I did do the public order training down at Gravesend, where you go down there and you have all your body armour on and you have your plastic shield, and they throw petrol bombs at you and brickbats and stuff, and it is stressful, it is testing. It's probably one of the hardest things I did, probably even harder than having the CS sprayed in my face at the police college at Hendon. So public order situations are demanding, they are stressful, but obviously police are trained for them. Now, when Ashli was shot, what had happened was she had gone up to a door which had been blockaded off, and there were chairs and a table behind that door trying to prevent people gaining access, and there were glass windows in the top level of the door, and I think Ashli and some other supporters, they wrongly smashed the glass in the top level of the door trying to come through the door and gain entrance to this corridor that had been blocked off. Now, when Ashli smashed the glass and tried to go through, you see on the video of her tragic death, there is an officer and he's holding a gun. A black officer, he's holding a gun pointing at the door, at the window being smashed. Now, Ashli wasn't shot straight away. It's not like the officer got out the gun and shot in a panic. That gun was held up for a good 1 or 2 even, maybe 2 even minutes. So that officer, he didn't shoot and panic in an instant. So he had a good minute at least to assess the situation, and he could see Ashli was female, and he could see she was smaller than him, and he could see she was unarmed, and he could see, most importantly, she wasn't a threat to his life or the life of the politicians he was guarding. So he was 100% wrong to shoot that gun, and that was disgusting use of excess force, and it was frankly murder. And the thing that really backs up my assessment that Ashli wasn't a threat is because on the side of the door where Ashli was with the other protesters, there were police on that side. And there were police who came up the stairs behind them, and they had helmets and body armour and guns, and they did not shoot their guns. So they were a lot closer to the protesters than the officer who shot on the other side of the door, and they did not feel under threat for their life to the point where they felt that excess force was necessary. So if the officers who were really close to Ashli and the other protesters around her didn't feel the need to discharge their weapons, why is an officer 10 feet away on the other side of the door, further away from Ashli and the protesters, feel that need to use lethal force? Because they're not attacking the officers who are right next to them. So if they get through that door, they're not going to attack him and the politicians who are further down the corridor, who I assume he was protecting. So, he wasn't under threat. The politicians behind him weren't under threat. Now, there's also the fact that, policemen have other options, even in America. He has a radio to call for backup. He has CS spray or tear gas to spray. He has a baton. He will have a taser gun maybe. Now, I'm aware that I think he was a plainclothes protection officer. Now, I know they don't often carry batons, but I know in England at least, I know they also carry a taser under their suit as well as a gun for lethal force, because you don't just go to lethal force as a police officer. There's lethal force is up there, and there's several levels you go through before you get to that. And he not only went to lethal force, but he went to it straight away, and he went to it, even though he'd had enough time to see it wasn't necessary, and he went to it even though there were officers nearer to Ashli who did not feel the need to use lethal force. So it was totally unjustified and totally wrong. And there's also the fact that, yes, there was violence when protesters felt the need to access the building, but from what I can tell, once they are inside, there was not a great deal of violence or destruction. Yes, there were a few people who smashed windows to get in. Yes, there were a few idiots who tried to steal things. So there was criminal damage and there was minor theft, but in a few isolated cases. Well, neither of those carry a death sentence. So if you look, this word that's been bandied about that they were domestic terrorists, well, I'd assume that some of those protesters were smokers, so some of them would have had a lot of lighters on them, where if they'd been intent on the maximum destruction, they would have set fires, but they didn't. And even once they got in the chamber itself, and the guy who was dressed like JK out of Jamiroquai, went rolling in, going like that with his big hat with the horns on. There was a policeman present in the chamber at that point, and this policeman didn't have any body armour on or anything. He just had a shirt, trousers, and his belt with his gun. And they didn't attack him, they didn't threaten him, no one, shouted at him even. He was just left to stand there and look at them, and they wandered about, they sat at Nancy Pelosi's desk, they photographed senators' papers, and they basically had a big thrill that they were in the chamber. And this wasn't terrorism. This is people who felt like they've been ignored, who felt like they don't count, that the liberal elites who sit in that chamber just look at them as white trash in flyover country. And this was them saying, look, we matter. This is our country too. That's what it was about. It wasn't about killing anyone or destroying the Capitol building. Because if those protesters had wanted to inflict the maximum damage, believe me, they could have done so. And looking, and one last thing about the deed itself. When Ashli was coming through the door, and I mean, in my experience, we had one time, I remember, there was a cannabis protest in Westminster, and someone was arrested because they had a cannabis plant on them. And it later turned out, because the arrest was for cultivation of cannabis, where someone pointed out to me later, I don't think it went anywhere because it was a stupid arrest, because unless that plant has grown from a seed to a plant in the time you've been standing there, to arrest them for cultivation of cannabis is just ridiculous. But that was an inspector who didn't know the law very well who decided on that, but never mind about that. But the fact is, once this woman had been arrested, some of the others in this cannabis protest tried to rescue her, their comrade, from the police. And it was just me and the officers who'd arrested her behind me, putting her in the van. So like about 10 or 15 of them came at me, and I just held up my baton and I shouted, "Get back." Now, that crowd could have overwhelmed me easily, but they knew that the first person to come at me would get hit with the baton, and no one wants to be the first person. So then they back off and the situation then calms down. Now, what that officer could have done, he could have fired his gun into the ceiling. He could have, there's a whole load of different things he could have done without the use of lethal force to calm that situation. And me, as someone who was a policeman who dealt with public order situations, which I know are stressful, can tell you more than a lot of people who haven't been in the police that use of force was totally unnecessary. But it's how also the protesters have been referred to. And remember, Black Lives Matter. 30 states had to call out the National Guard. There were 300 cities under curfew, and it spread round the world. I mean, we had people in England pulling down statues that had stood for hundreds of years. We had, I mean, I don't know if you remember on Whitehall, there was that poor police horse. I mean, I don't know what that poor police horse had ever done to oppress black people. There was a thug pushed I won't say what colour he was. There was a thug pushed one of those hire bikes that you get on the street into the side of this poor police horse, and and I think the poor police officer even died. So you had serious violence where police horses were killed and police officers were injured, and in the USA, numerous people were killed, far more than five, and all the time mainstream media was talking about protesters. Never once was the word domestic terrorist used, and they wonder why we get so angry and feel so unrepresented and so alienated from the political system and the media. And this is why it's the double standard. And anyone who takes the time to look can see that double standard. And again, the Black Lives Matter protest, it showed us, whether we like it or not, race matters, because other black people in London, they felt more affinity with a black man who was killed in another country thousands of miles away by in a totally different jurisdiction. They felt so much affinity with that man that they were prepared to go out and attack fellow British passport holders. So the idea that they felt some sort of Britishness or some British solidarity, they felt closer to another black person in America than they did to their fellow Britons. Hence, they were prepared to go out and riot and attack fellow Britons because their race was more important to them than their British passport. And Liberals don't like this, but it's true. I'm not in the back room of a pub, so I haven't got red wine. So I have to make do with spiced lemon tea. But there's another fact about the death of George Floyd and the death of see, look, even her name isn't on my lips. Ashli Babbitt is the response to it. So it's not only the fact that poor Ashli was unjustly murdered, it's been the response to it as well. Now you compare when George Floyd died, within 24 hours more or less, all 4 police officers involved in the incident had lost their jobs. And obviously 2 of them were non-white, so that didn't even help them. I think one was obviously a Korean guy and one was a Latin guy. But all 4 of them, including the poor guy who'd only joined about 6 months ago, lost their jobs in 24 hours, and they're all in jail and all facing charges. And straight away, we knew all their names. And there were world leaders all over the world paying tribute to George Floyd. Now, this police officer or special protection officer who killed Ashli Babbitt, he hasn't lost his job. We don't know his name. The mainstream media haven't tried to find out who he is. You don't get anyone in the media paying tribute to Ashli Babbitt, even though she was unjustly murdered by law enforcement, exactly the same as George Floyd. And this is one of the things that's really annoyed me about Trump. Even Trump hasn't said the name Ashli Babbitt. And if you put the name Ashli Babbitt into Google to try and find out about her, because I know she was an Air Force veteran, I know she ran a company that installed or repaired swimming pools with her husband, but it's very sketchy what you can find. Now, Mark Collett, to his credit, he did a video on Ashli Babbitt, and even Mark, who's a full-time political worker, he couldn't, who obviously researches into these videos he makes very deeply, even he had a limited amount of facts about her. So this shows there's been a suppression about Ashli, about the name of the man who shot her, about her and her life and her character, and there's very, very little you can find out about her. Now, contrast this to George Floyd. We knew all about him. We saw his image everywhere. We had everyone paying tribute to him. You know, saying what a great guy he was. Now, if we look at the Floyd incident, first of all, he wasn't murdered on camera. So, you know, this narrative that he was murdered for giving off a fake $20 bill. No, he wasn't murdered. Yes, Derek Chauvin does seem, when you watch the video, a little bit of a bully. He does seem to go overboard. But let's put this in context. George Floyd, he had a violent and long and criminal history, and we all know about he put a gun to a pregnant woman's belly. So when officers had their interaction with him, they would have done a radio check. They would have heard that long and extensive criminal history on their radio check, and that would have put them on edge. Also, the man had overdosed on fentanyl, and he was behaving, I would assume, to end up on the ground like that in a very aggressive and very threatening manner. Now, the technique that was used, I would assume that technique was used to prevent a suspect biting an officer. Now, I don't think it's a very intelligent or wise technique to kneel on someone's neck, but if you look at the video, I don't think he was putting the whole weight of his knee on the neck. And also, what you have to remember is that officers in situations like this, and the same goes for prison officers when they're restraining someone, they will use techniques of restraint that they have been taught in training. You can't just go in and do a Karate Kid and use your own little move that you've learnt in your dojo outside work. You in a restraint and control situation will use the techniques you have been taught by your officer safety training instructors. And so that technique of restraining the neck would, I assume, have been taught by the police department in which Chauvin worked. And he wasn't new, he was 19 years in, so he obviously wouldn't be, you know, getting the techniques wrong because he had 19 years of experience. So a lot of the blame lies on the department for teaching this technique. And yes, Chauvin may have gone overboard with it. Yes, Chauvin may have been a bit of a bully. He doesn't look that likeable a man, but he's not some racist fanatic, because he was married to a Korean or Chinese lady, and he knew he was on film. So the very idea that a police officer who knows he's being filmed, who has a great awareness of the law, will, you know, deliberately and openly murder someone is just ridiculous. So maybe he deserves a manslaughter trial for going overboard, but he didn't murder anyone. And I was very disappointed with Dr. Savage on his radio show when he said that it was a racist murder, because that was hysterical and stupid. And someone as clever as Dr. Savage should know not to go down this hysterical leftist route, but to look at all the facts in front of you. And there's the final fact about George Floyd is that he wasn't just handing over a fake $20 bill. He was high on fentanyl, probably had enough fentanyl in him to kill a horse, and he was about to get in a car and drive, where he could have run over a small child. So he wasn't just handing over a fake $20 bill. He was about to drive a big 4x4 Jeep whilst off his head on drugs, which is a serious offence and can lead to death or maiming or numerous bad outcomes. Now, I had a debate about this on Instagram, Ashli's death, and it was on Catherine Narducci, the soprano actress's page, and it was a black guy started debating me, and he referred to domestic terrorist Babbitt in very derisory terms, and said the cop feared for his life. And I just said to him, I said, if that cop had been a white man who shot that gun, and Ashli Babbitt had been a black female Black Lives Matter protester, we would all know his name, and he would be in jail now awaiting trial. And he didn't have an answer, and he came back with some nonsense. Oh, he feared for his life. We didn't fear for his life, because the officers on the other side of the door, who also had arms, who are a lot closer to the protesters, never felt the need to fire their guns. And to give Catherine Narducci credit, even though she might be a bit left-wing, she actually put on the end of our little debate, well, I'm sad about any person dying. So even if she's a bit left-wing, at least she's got the intelligence to have an open-minded approach to things. And as I've said, the aftermath, Ashli Babbitt's name, it never left Trump's lips. Trump never stood up and said the name of Ashli and the names of the other people who died. And their deaths were directly created by a situation that he began and by words that he spoke. And he can't even, stand up and pay tribute to her and make offers to help the families of those 5 people and finance the funerals or show some support. And a couple of days after this happened, I think it was Martin Luther King Day in the US. And Melania Trump was all over Instagram saying how brilliant and wonderful Martin Luther King was. And I said, well, rather than worrying about a historic figure, why don't you pay tribute to one of your husband's supporters who died last week? If you can virtue signal about a man who was shot 50 years ago, you can surely virtue signal about some poor woman who flew all the way across the country and then ended up shot in the neck because she supported and loved your husband and trusted him wrongly, as it turns out. And I also told her that this secular sainthood that Martin Luther King has been raised to is totally wrong. I mean, not only did he plagiarise his PhD, he also, I think, was notorious for sleeping with prostitutes and all sorts of things. And I mean, I don't care what people get up to in private, but the fact is, if you're walking around with a dog collar on saying you're a man of God, maybe sleeping with prostitutes behind your wife's back and setting yourself up as some sort of moral paragon of virtue does make you a bit of a hypocrite. And in terms of black leaders from the 60s, I would say that Malcolm X is a far greater and far more sincere and far more charismatic and far more intelligent person than Martin Luther King ever was. And I've seen Malcolm X speak on interviews, and I've been struck by his intelligence and charisma. And the fact is, the white liberals don't like him because he didn't subscribe to the multicultural agenda. He said to black people, you can't go in the white school, don't be whinging to be bussed all the way across town to the right white school. Take your own school, make your own school, twice as good as the white school and have some pride in it. And that message, that really powerful message, if black people had listened to and followed and had a leader like that, they'd be far better off today than they would be with this fraud of Martin Luther King. And you notice Malcolm X's name is never spoken by the Liberals because he doesn't suit their agenda. And Malcolm X, he was also prepared to sit down and talk to people who had a white nationalist, a white separatist viewpoint. And he was prepared to sit and talk to them sensibly and decently without screaming the word racist like most white liberals do. Now, when we look at all this, at the death of Ashli Babbitt and George Floyd, the final trump card that people come up with is that black people have had, hundreds of years of suffering under slavery, and so a nasty white man like me can't appreciate the suffering that their ancestors have been through. And so this justifies the fact that today a black person who is unfortunately accidentally killed, like George Floyd, his death is more important than a white person like Ashli Babbitt, who was maliciously, deliberately murdered. So we get to slavery. Well, most people, they just talk about it. They don't look into it. They don't try and read about it. Well, obviously, I have, because I'm interested to find out what's behind all this. Now, I recommend Master, Tyranny and Desire by Trevor Bernard, and it's about Thomas Thistlewood, who went to Jamaica in 1750, and he was a slave overseer and later the owner of a small plantation. And the shocking thing is he was quite a well-educated man, quite a well-read man, and he did engage in acts of brutality and nastiness that are a shock when you read it. I mean, there's one poor slave in here, I think it was Phoebe, and I think it was in 1776, this poor woman, she wished she was dead. I think, 23rd of July 1776, Thistlewood flogged Phoebe for wishing she was dead already. Now, obviously, and there were obviously other even worse acts of brutality and sadism. But what you have to do with a tragic history like this is put it in context. And when you look at the 18th century, it actually says at the back of this book that a soldier, a private soldier in the British Army, was just as likely as a black slave to be flogged. And in the amount of floggings he would see every month. And we're not just talking about 6 lashes, we're talking about brutal, terrible floggings of 20, 30, 50 lashes. And a British soldier, a British private soldier who'd been conscripted, was actually more likely to be executed than a black slave, because the black slave had a monetary value to their owner, whereas the poor British squaddy, he didn't have any monetary value to his officers. So yes, terrible, nasty, brutal things did happen unjustly and wrongly to black slaves, but the 18th century was a brutal time. And it wasn't black people all on their own suffering by any means. And rather than just shouting slavery, slavery, people need to look and see about the 18th century and what sort of time it was. I mean, there was any one of 200 acts that you could be hanged for in Britain in the 18th century. one of which was impersonating an Egyptian. Well, someone must have tried it once. Now, obviously, what we want to do is, now we've got to the point on the alt-right, on the nationalist right, where people are prepared to go out on the street and say, I'm against this, I'm fed up with it, I've had enough of it. And especially now with the economic chaos that's going to follow the coronavirus and the big recession, people are going to be open to our message. And what we've now got to do, we've got to be aware that, as Jason, No White Guilt, has said, Jason, who appears on Patriotic Weekly Review every week, that we've got to be welcoming a movement of redemption. I mean, I think it was Hegel who said no society can leave totally the society that went before. Now, we've all grown up. I mean, I was born in 1978, but, you know, it wasn't such a big thing, the multiculturalism, when I was a youngster, but it's got bigger and bigger. So people born, you know, 98, 2000, it would be their, you know, their whole lives. They a totally multicultural, totally PC society. So we've got to be flexible and welcoming. And you know, in terms of mixed race people who are pro-white, I mean, my two favourite traditional wife, right-wing traditional women are gorgeous Lacey Lynn and stunning Bernadine Bluntly. Now, Bernadine Bluntly, she's half Filipino, but she's pro-white. She's against cultural Marxism. She's a Christian. She's integrated. Now, if we start purity spiralling and turning good people like that away, just at the point when we can hit the big time, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I think a similar period in history, in terms of what we want to do, was when Mary Tudor came back after years of her brother Edward and Henry before making England Protestant. She restored Catholicism, and she did it gradually, and she did it flexibly. And one of the people who helped her was Cardinal Pole. Now, just as we've had people who've been their whole lives in the multicultural society, you know, back then religion was a much bigger thing. So they had people, obviously, in the Parliament, in the ruling power structure, who'd gone along, as they had to do with Henry VIII and with the King Edward, in Protestantism. So they had to reintroduce Catholicism, but they had to do it in a flexible way that meant that people with a Protestant past weren't scared off. So this is a brilliant book. It's Anna Whitlock on Mary Tudor. And Cardinal Pole, when he spoke to Parliament, he said about the past, and he said, "My commission is of grace and clemency to such as will receive it, for touching all matters that be past, that shall be as things cast into the sea of forgetfulness." So that was the approach that Mary Tudor and Cardinal Pole did with the Parliament, the men in the Parliament, the men in the ruling elite, and that it was an approach of flexibility, and you know, we're not going to look at someone and say, oh, because you were a Protestant 5 years ago, we're going to persecute you now. And obviously, as things went on, they had heretics who wouldn't reconvert to Catholicism. This was people lower down the class structure, and sadly and wrongly, they were burnt. And obviously, this then rebounded on Mary and has left her with a bad historical reputation, and it created the anti-Catholicism which lasted in England right up until the 19th century. So this shows when we, and this was something Franco said about the Nazis, General Franco, he said, can't the Germans see that the things they're doing on the Eastern Front with the Einsatz group and things like that, they're undermining their own cause. And so we're in this position now where we're in a position of strength with people being prepared to come out on the street with a massive post-coronavirus recession coming, with total disillusionment with the liberal and globalist ruling elites' ideas. And this is why they're coming in harder and harder with the internet censorship, because they know our ideas are powerful. And they're even reaching now for Russian-style tactics. I mean, I debated some fool, some Indian guy who I used to work with, and he actually told me the other day, because I debated politics with him, he told me, "Oh, go and seek professional help with your bigoted right-wing views. You need professional help." And I said to him, you know, in the Soviet Union, they said that people who had right-wing, non-communist views were mentally ill, and they put them in asylums. So, but the reason they're having to ratchet up this pressure is because they know there's a weakness in their arguments, there's a weakness in their system. And as Dr. Dutton says, you look at best friends, they're more genetically similar than random chance would lead to be the case. And this is because people feel comfortable and most at ease amongst those like themselves. And this is why multiculturalism just doesn't work. This is why black people in London, they felt more of a link with a man thousands of miles away being restrained in America than they did with their fellow Britons. So they went out and rioted. Now, in terms of the Soviet system and some of the repression we may well come to see. I know a lot of people aren't going to like this. It's Menachem Begin, and he wrote White Nights. It's about his experiences in prison under the NKVD and in the Stalinist Gulag system in Soviet Russia. And he says about, I mean, whatever our opinion on the ethno-state of Israel, this is a good book in terms of it shows the mentality of the authoritarian left. And he says about how his interrogators would have all these Stalinist, Leninist arguments. And the problem was that they all, when you looked at these arguments at root, they were unstable. They were illogical, and they had to keep having more and more expositions and bizarre theories just to justify the original argument, because the original argument lacked logic. And when he speaks here about after one interrogation by the NKVD, and it reminded him of a quote from Archimedes, the ancient discoverer of the laws of nature, and in ancient Greece. And he said, "Give me a leaning point, and I will shake the foundations of the earth." And as I say, good book, Menachem Begin, White Nights. Now, what Archimedes is saying there is that if at the core of the argument there is a weakness, there is a leaning point, you shake that, the whole thing will collapse. Now this argument, the central argument of the left, that race is just a social construct, that race is just skin pigmentation, that we're all the same, I mean, it's not about who's better or worse. The fact is, if you look at states that were de facto white ethno-states set up by white people, Australia, New Zealand, they are very different to states that were de facto ethno-states set up by black people, Haiti, Liberia. Now, those differences are there, and that's at the core of the left's argument that all humans are identical, and they're not. And I'd urge everyone to watch The Jolly Heretic, watch Dr. Dutton, and see these differences are there. And it's not about putting anyone else down or making fun of anyone else's civilization. It's just about saying the civilizations of the world are different, and we all have a right to our place in the world. And white people, like every other group, have a right to an indigenous homeland, and that homeland is Europe. And in America, because they built America, they have a right to a large part of America to live on, as do other groups who've been there for hundreds of years. So, I mean, long term, I would imagine America would partition along racial and cultural and maybe even political lines. But as Archimedes said, if the foundation of the argument is weak, the whole thing will eventually collapse. And this is what happened with Stalinism. This is what happened with Ceausescu's Romania. And with the left, they know the inherent weakness, and this is why. They know we're shaking those foundations of that argument that race is just a social construct. We're all the same. We're all just individuals. We're not affected by our ancestors, our environment, our race. Well, race is about humans, like every other animal on the planet, adapting to their environment. And the idea that humans have been the only animal in the history of the world ever to make no adaptation or no changes to their environment is patently ridiculous. I mean, I live here in Lanzarote, and obviously I love Spanish people. I speak Spanish. I'm a great admirer of Spanish culture, but I can see even fellow Europeans who are from a different part of Europe, there are slight differences in the way they behave and mannerisms and social interactions than the way people behave in England. And that doesn't mean that anyone's better or worse. It just means they're different. And we see this every day. Race is culture gone to seed. And the left's argument that race doesn't exist, that it's just a social construct, the very foundation of it is weak. And this is why they're going to come in with this suppression, with these social media bans, with more and more making it harder and harder for us to speak to each other online, because they know the core weakness at the centre of their argument. Well, I'm sorry to go on so long, but I felt very strongly about this, and I do hope that when we do win, that tribute is paid to people like Ashli and others who have given their lives because they believed in our cause. And I would also hope that at some point she gets justice and the man who unjustly murdered her stands trial. And that's why I made this video. And that's, I mean, I've rambled on into various avenues and topics, but the central point of it is, things are going to get quite hard for us in the upcoming years. But things are only going to get hard because we've got logic and reason and the best arguments on our side. Right, thanks for your time.